Hello everybody, and welcome to Ancient Architects. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news and independent research from around the world. Hopefully you saw my last video, which looked at a number of structures on the Giza Plateau that do seem to predate the 4th dynasty. The bedrock pathway beneath the Khafre Causeway, the Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple, the Khafre Proto-Mortuary Temple, and also the Tomb of Khentkaus and the Tomb of Kai. I won't go back into the detail now, but in a nutshell, because the eroded southern wall of the Sphinx enclosure seems to have been levelled to build the Khafre Causeway, it implies that the Sphinx was carved before Khafre came to power. And because the Sphinx Temple is made from stone from around the Sphinx, this therefore also predates Khafre. And because the Valley Temple was built before the Sphinx Temple, as seen by one structure overlapping the other, the Valley Temple must predate Khafre. To cut a long story short, these are the structures that evidence shows could be the oldest on the Giza Plateau, if the pyramids are indeed 4th dynasty. Whether the pyramids were built by Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure is of course open to debate, but what we can't debate is the fact that the Giza Plateau was a huge cemetery in the 4th dynasty, as shown by the countless mastabas that surround the pyramids. It continued to be a cemetery up to the 6th dynasty. So, the question is, why did the kings of the 4th dynasty turn Giza into an acropolis? Why did they choose this specific location? If the earlier dating of these structures is correct, as stated in my last video, then Giza was chosen to be a cemetery not because it was a random piece of flat ground near Memphis, but because the structures already present must have had some significance. It must have already been a ceremonial or religious location, somehow related to death or the afterlife. To an extent, this video is speculative, I admit that. But hopefully I can articulate my thinking, and show you how I'm connecting the dots with regards to what Giza might have been before the 4th dynasty. The best place to start was the ancient name of Giza, which researchers believe was Rostau, and this leads us straight to the main god of Memphis in early dynastic times, a god known as Sokar. He was known as He of Rostau, and Lord of the Secret Places. Sokar was the original god of the underworld before he became absorbed into Osiris, when he became a composite god known as Sokar Osiris. It is thought that the falcon-headed Horus got his appearance from Sokar, who, as you can see, was depicted in the same way, although Sokar sometimes appears mummified, but with a falcon head. In fact, a number of scholars believe that Sokar was a pre-incarnation of both Osiris and Horus, a syncretized version of them both. He is one of the oldest and most venerated gods of ancient Egypt, and has a history that likely goes all the way back to pre-dynastic times, primarily worshipped at Memphis, but having his sanctuary and dominion at Rostau, which most believe is quite literally Giza, not Saqqara, which researchers know went by a different name. There are a number of sources that authors quote to say that Giza was Rostau. First there is the Dream Stealer, positioned between the paws of the Sphinx in the 18th dynasty by Thutmose IV. And on this stela, it says that the Sphinx is located beside Sokar in Rostau. In the New Kingdom funerary text, titled the Amduat, or the Book of That which is in the Underworld, it speaks of Sokar as governing the subterranean realm of Rostau. It seems to be the name given to the 4th and 5th hours of the Underworld, also known as the Duat, but many scholars also believe that Rostau was a literal place, and this place is Giza. The inventory stela that was found at Giza mentions Osiris as Lord of Rostau, and although some do believe that Rostau is just a mythical place of ancient Egyptian religion, in their respective books, Robert Bauval and Robert Temple discuss at length how Rostau was literally the Giza Plateau, and a number of academics agree. Miriam Lichteen was an academic who received a PhD in Egyptology, and during her career, she translated a number of ancient Egyptian texts. In her work, she concluded that Rostau was indeed the necropolis of Giza. Mythologist Rundle Clark says that not only was Rostal the modern Giza, but it was also specifically the home of a form of Osiris known as Sokar. In the Atlas of Ancient Egypt by Baines and Malek, they place Rostal in southern Giza, being a literal place in the Memphite necropolis. Egyptologist George Goyon placed Rostal in the modern village of Giza, whilst Egyptologist Raymond Faulkner believed that Rostal was Giza before the word was used to describe a place in the underworld. The famous Egyptologist Selim Hassan noted the similarities between the 5th division of the Duat and the Giza necropolis, as seen from the south side of the Sphinx. So, the fact that so many scholars believe there is evidence to show that Giza was known as Rostal seems compelling. Many people believe that the Great Sphinx could have been a lion in its first incarnation, before the head was recarved. And, if it was most likely a depiction of Aker, the lion god and guardian of the underworld or Duat, aka Rostal, the realm of Sokar, who was commonly known as Lord of the Underworld. Aker lions were therefore strongly associated with Sokar, and lions or sphinxes are often shown with Sokar in ancient Egyptian artwork that depicts the 5th hour of the Duat. The Aker lion, which from the Middle Kingdom onwards was often shown as a pair of lions, has a history that goes back to the 1st dynasty, just like another important symbol of Sokar, which is known as the Henu bark, and I'll come to this shortly. As noted by Robert Bauval in his book Secret Chamber, in the Book of the Two Ways from the Middle Kingdom, it says that the highland of Aker is the dwelling place of Osiris. The highland of Aker the Lion is believed to be the Giza Plateau, and we know that Osiris amalgamated with Sokar and also became known as Lord of Rostal. Interestingly, in later dynastic history, Aker was depicted as 2 merged torsos of recumbent sphinxes, both of which had human heads. The main thing to note here though, is that in the earliest of dynastic history, Aker was a single lion deity, and he is the best explanation for the original identity of the Sphinx. So I haven't gone into as much detail as I could, but a broad range of experts, both academic and alternative, seem to agree that Giza was once known as Rostal. And so, this all implies that Giza was once a sacred landscape of one of the oldest and most powerful gods of the old capital Memphis, the god of the underworld and the 5th hour of the Duat, Sokar. This could well be before the Pyramid Age of the 4th dynasty, and could therefore be the reason that Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure built their pyramids at this location. It also suggests that there was an underworld or subterranean level at Giza, something that I believe was extensive and still remains hidden to this day. Yet we do know it exists, and Andrew Collins has shown there are caves within the Giza bedrock. So I think we can establish that Giza was once a sacred landscape of the god Sokar, who we know became Sokar Osiris, and although it seems most likely that the Sphinx was the guardian Aker lion, in previous videos I gave my own hypothesis that the Sphinx could have been a representation of Sokar. The Sphinx could have portrayed Sokar in one of 2 ways. Firstly as a Sokar hawk or falcon, which looked like this in ancient Egypt. As you can see, the large front part does look strange. Could these models actually have been miniature, crude depictions of the Sphinx from ancient times? Could this protruding front part have been carved into the legs of the current Sphinx? Furthermore, the New Kingdom Egyptians called the Sphinx Horumakhet, which means Horus of the Horizon. Horus was of course a hawk or falcon-headed god whose origin also lies with Sokar. So this explanation does seem to have some merit, although I must admit that it is more of a stretch. The second way the Sphinx could have been Sokar in an earlier time was if it was a representation of the Mound of Sokar, identified as the Mound of Creation, but often included a hawk's head on top. As mentioned previously, Sokar's sacred boat was known as the Henu bark, which was kept inside a structure known as the Henu bark Sanctuary. Sokar was portrayed on his solar boat as some kind of hawk-headed mound of stone. Therefore was the Sphinx a huge effigy of this Sokar mound. Whatever the Sphinx was, I believe it must have been associated with Sokar's realm of the 5th hour of the Duat. So, in my opinion, it was either a representation of Sokar, or the more likely option being the Acre Lion. A third option is Anubis, as detailed by Robert Temple, and I'll discuss the Sokar-Anubis relationship in another video, because I don't think it's as strong as Sokar's relationship with the lion god Acre. Either way, because of the pre-4th Dynasty age of the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, I would certainly suggest that one of these temples was indeed the Hennu Bark Sanctuary, situated in front of a huge guardian Acre lion, or maybe the Hawk of Sokar. Remember, the Dream Sealer from the New Kingdom says the Sphinx is beside Sokar in Rostau, and, of course, right beside the Sphinx, actually right in front of it, are the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple. Although I came to this conclusion myself, I have noted that other authors, including Boval and Temple, have also stated that one of these temples could have been dedicated to Sokar, but maybe they both were. Maybe one was an early Temple of Sokar, and the other was the Hennu Bark Sanctuary, side by side in front of the Sphinx. There is also more supporting evidence in the form of the many stone tablets deposited by pilgrims at the Sphinx over time. Many of these were discovered by Selim Hassan in the 1930s. According to Mark Lehner, some of the tablets refer to the Sphinx and the Sphinx Sanctuary as the Chamber of Sokar. He also states that Thutmose IV called the Sphinx the Sanctuary of Sokar. Furthermore, in tomb paintings where we see this depiction of the Sphinx, it is often called Acre, the guardian of the entrance of the underworld. So it seems the Egyptians themselves also believed that the Sphinx was a depiction of Acre the lion. For a little look at the Hennu Bark Sanctuary in Egyptian art, here we can see a relief from a Memphite tomb chapel at Saqqara, showing a man named Mose and his wife, who are offering the head of an oryx before Sokar's Hennu Bark, which is sitting inside the Hennu Bark Sanctuary. Some of the text reads, "A pure offering to thy Ka, Ptah Sokar Osiris, who dwells in the Shetayet, the great god, Lord of Rostau." The Shetayet of Rostau is the Lower Egyptian equivalent to the Tomb of Osiris in Abydos, which I'll come to shortly. In ancient Egypt, the Feast of Sokar was an extremely popular festival that continued all the way up into the New Kingdom, a traditional yet extremely ancient custom for the Egyptians. Here we see the Hennu Bark in its sanctuary from the times of Ramesses III, and here we can see it again from the First Dynasty. As this demonstrates, the Hennu Bark was iconic all the way through dynastic history. During the ancient festival, a stone carved with a hawk's head on top was loaded onto the wooden Hennu Bark, which was taken from its sanctuary and pulled ceremoniously on a sled, followed by people wearing garlands of onions. The spirits of the dead were thought to join in the festival of Sokar, which seems to have celebrated the journey between the realms of the living and the dead, or the sunrise to sunset, east to west and then back again through the underworld. Now I note another pre-4th Dynasty structure on the Giza Plateau, the road of bedrock beneath the Khafre Causeway, which evidence suggests is one of the oldest features of Giza. I believe that this was central in the Sokar festival, and could well be the ancient roadway that was used to drag Sokar's sacred Hennu Bark from east to west like the movement of the sun in the sky, and then back again to the Hennu Bark Sanctuary in the east, like the sun moving through the underworld. The Hennu Bark is believed by many to be an early representation of the famous solar boat of ancient Egypt, and by being pulled on a sled, this movement is thought to have symbolised the sun's slow movement across the sky, from sunrise to sunset. As stated, the festival of Sokar was a truly ancient custom, and the Hennu Bark is shown on the First Dynasty Naqada label, as well as on the Jet Comb and other pieces of First Dynasty art. It is an ancient ritual of pre-4th Dynasty times, originating in Memphis in the Delta region. It was a festival that took place annually throughout dynastic history, and we also know that it took place in a number of different regions. but did it originate at Giza, aka Rostau, which, as we know, is also the name of Sokar's underworld realm. As stated, at Rostau there was apparently a shrine to Sokar, and this was called the Shetayet, which apparently means the Tomb of God. Its location has never been determined, but it is thought to have been somewhere at Giza. There are a few candidates about where it could be. For a start, it seems likely to be either at the western end of the Khafre Causeway or somewhere close to the causeway. So, the Shetayet of Sokar could be the proto-mortuary temple of Khafre, located at the western end of the ancient road, which certainly looks to be an ancient structure. But it could also be another famous site. As mentioned, the cult of Osiris absorbed the falcon-headed god Sokar, including all of his attributes and all of his holy sites. Sokar became Sokar Osiris, and later still Ptah Sokar Osiris. The Shetayet of Sokar therefore evolved into the Tomb of Osiris. And what do we find at Giza, situated to the west of the Sphinx just off the Khafre Causeway? An extremely deep burial shaft known today as the Tomb of Osiris, which we know was cut in Old Kingdom times. During my research, when joining the dots in such a manner, it does sometimes feel too good to be true. But, as stated, this is really just a working hypothesis, and I'm just following leads and seeing where they take me. There is so much more work that needs to be done. Researcher Jeff Graham said that Sokar represented the fertility that lies at the bottom of the underworld, as well as the minerals and vegetable produce of the earth. He also said that in the night sky, Sokar identified with the constellation Orion, attributes taken on by Osiris. This is one reason why Robert Bauval believes the Giza pyramids are an earthly representation of that constellation, Heaven's Mirror, the realm of Sokar created on Earth. So, Giza is the sanctuary of Sokar. We have a giant lion-esque statue that predates the 4th dynasty, and we also have an ancient ceremonial walkway and at least 3 ancient temples. If the Sphinx was a lion, as Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, Robert Schoch and Manu Safzada believe, as well as many others, it is interesting to note that Acre lions often come in pairs, albeit from the Middle Kingdom onwards. As we can see on these later depictions of Sokar in the underworld, there are in fact 2 sphinxes. So maybe once upon a time, there was also another sphinx monument, maybe built from stone on the Giza Plateau, maybe facing west at the other end of the Khafre Causeway. It is of course unlikely, but I thought I may as well mention it as an idea. Interestingly, this image depicts Sokar and the underworld as being between the 2 sphinxes. And, as I showed on a recent video, I believe there was a subterranean tunnel that started at the tomb of Kenkawus and ended on the northern edge of the Giza Plateau, an alignment that is perfectly perpendicular to the ancient sacred road, which today is known as the Khafre Causeway. So is this a crude picture of Giza looking north? Above the pair of sphinxes and Sokar is what experts believe is a representation of the Mound of Creation. But what if this mound isn't above Sokar, but is actually a pyramid behind him in the background? What if this is actually the Great Pyramid? Could this pyramid have been on the Giza landscape before the 4th dynasty as well? One grand pyramid being a representation of the Mound of Creation, which is really all that's needed to complete the sacred landscape of Sokar at Rostau, all before the 4th dynasty. This would mean that Jean-Pierre Houdin is correct regarding how he believes the Great Pyramid was built, as mentioned in my last video. But it would also mean that many hundreds of years passed before Khafre built his pyramid on the plateau. Maybe this is why so much erosion was allowed to build up on the Sphinx enclosure walls, and why Khafre had to level this causeway in the 4th dynasty, and also why the Great Pyramid is a far grander structure than any other pyramid in Egypt, because it was the original, the one that everyone tried to replicate, and the one that Khufu wanted to be associated with. Like many others have long speculated, did Khufu just recase the Great Pyramid, a representation of the Mound of Creation, and then simply add a causeway for his own funeral and digging his new tomb down in the bedrock. Obviously there is no supporting evidence, it really is just speculation, but we all have to start somewhere. I'll look into this further in a future video. In my opinion, Giza was the realm of Sokar, and I believe that this was since the beginning of dynastic history. And for this hypothesis to have any merit, I need to go further and find more supporting evidence. Or maybe evidence that proves that this in fact is incorrect. Either way, I only want to find the truth. We know that Giza was once known as Rostau, the name also given to Sokar's realm in the underworld. We have evidence of Sokar having a relationship with Giza, which is shown most explicitly on the Dreamstealer, but also on many other texts from ancient Egypt. We have a giant statue of an Acre lion, a god who once guarded Sokar's underworld. We have ancient structures that predate the 4th dynasty, together with a ceremonial walkway which could well be associated with the Henu bark and Sokar worship. We have a structure known as the Tomb of Osiris, which could have once been the Shetayet of Sokar, after the god was renamed and amalgamated with Osiris. And we also have evidence of an underworld cave system, possibly with canals below the Giza Plateau. We also have the greatest pyramid ever made, the Great Pyramid, which would complete the sacred landscape as a representation of Sokar's mound of creation. I'm sure many authors and researchers have come to similar conclusions, especially Robert Bauval and Robert Temple, but I'll list the sources that I used for this video in the description below. I'd love to hear what you think, so please comment your thoughts below. Thank you very much for watching this episode of Ancient Architects. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, please like the video, and please leave a comment below. Thank you very much.